Half a Moon In, Chapter 2. Long after the wagon had disappeared into the woods, Aaron remained standing where he was, staring off in its direction, following along with his eyes where he imagined it to be. Seagulls circled and squawked overhead. A breeze blew through his hair, and at last he turned back toward the house and lay down in the grass, gazing out at sea. After all, it was only half a day's journey to Craftsbury, he said to himself. She'd be back soon enough. Why, tomorrow at noon, and not one moment later. He'd begun to feel better already, and there'd be a birthday present coming home with her as well. He broke into a smile, feverishly wondering what it might be. His mind was aflutter with visions as he lay there, listening to the gulls and feeling the sea breeze on his face, when suddenly he realized he was all on his own, and free to do whatever he wished. He felt airy and light and bursting with energy, and he began rolling in the grass, dizzily, joyfully, squealing with laughter inside. Staying home all alone would be grand. He picked himself up and scampered down to the beach. Immediately he remembered what his mother had told him, and he looked back at the house, perched just beyond the grasp of the tides. His father had loved the solitude of the sea, and he'd cleared the road that led down from the forest by himself, and built a house at its end. Small and white with a thick thatched roof, it was stuck out on a point jutting into the ocean, where there were no other houses about, and under its gaze, Aaron gleefully passed the morning. He skipped stone after stone on the water. He scrambled about the rocks like a crab. He imagined himself a mighty orator, addressing the waters in a thundering bass, commanding the very ocean as though he were its captain. Break now, waves, and split your ribs on the rocks. Let the spray fly up. Let the waters foam. Fishes swim. Snails crawl. Seagulls, dive for your dinners in the sea. He could hear himself clearly inside his head, shouting out his orders in a fine, deep voice, trilling his R's magnificently, casting his words out over the water, all the way to the horizon. When he grew hungry, Aaron walked back to the house and kindled a fire in the stove. He cooked himself a bowl of buckwheat groats and returned once again to the beach, peering into tide pools and scanning the horizon, imagining himself a sailing man like his father. All afternoon he busied himself, and when the sun at last edged back behind the trees and shadows spread onto the beach, Aaron reluctantly walked back home, hungry and tired, and with his pockets full of shells. It was growing dark in the house, and he lit one of the lamps, built a fire in the stove, and placed a pot of peas on to boil. Night was coming on, and the breeze picking up, with a few ragged clouds blowing in from the sea. He listened to the wind as it rushed over the house, rattling the windows and fluttering the flame in the lamp, and felt a chill pass through him. Swiftly, the light left the sky. Outside, the waves crashed blindly against the rocks in the blackness, and suddenly the house seemed empty and abandoned, as though its last owners had long since left it to the spiders and swallows. Aaron gazed slowly about the room. At the spinning wheel, at the clock his father had brought back from his travels, at the massive loom, still and silent in the corner. The house felt as lifeless as a tomb, and he longed to hear the sound of his mother spinning, or of her softly singing while she wove. Aaron pulled his chair up next to the stove, his eyes alert and his ears tense to every sound in the wind, suddenly believing himself to hear footsteps approaching, then distant thunder, then the clatter of horses' hoofs. He stared at the wall across the room, and seemed to see it almost imperceptibly bulge and sink, like skin over a heart. The wind roared over the house in a rage when he rose to fetch himself a bowl of porridge, and he ate as quickly and quietly as he could, trying to keep from looking out the windows for fear of what he might see. When he was through with his dinner, Aaron sat for a while, letting the fire burn down. Then he latched the door, blew out the lamp, and climbed quickly into bed. He lay there listening to the wind whistling by on the other side of the wall, glanced out the window across the room, and beheld an entire armada of clouds, silently riding the wind in from the sea. He watched them passing before the stars, as stealthily as spies, gazed at them endlessly, migrating across the sky, and slowly fell into sleep. When he awoke in the morning, Aaron sensed a chill in the air. He looked out the window, dashed out of bed, and threw open the door in disbelief. Snow was falling thickly out of the sky. He darted back across the room and jumped into his clothes, shivering in the cold and with his teeth chattering at a gallop. Never had he known the first snow of the winter to arrive so early. Usually it didn't come until Christmas, and then only a dusting of snowflakes at that. But this... Aaron squeezed into his boots and ventured outside, to find his feet sinking into a full half-foot of snow. The fields were covered completely, and the woods in the distance were white. It must have been snowing all night. He looked about in amazement, walked back inside, and lit a fire in the stove. What would become of his mother? A half-foot of snow wouldn't hold up the wagon. And she said she'd return home by noon, just as always. He peered out the window at the road, but could barely make it out under the snow. Surely she wouldn't leave him here longer than she'd promised, not on his birthday. Aaron shed his coat and his cap, and sat down by the stove. The wind had died down during the night, and there wasn't a sound to be heard from outside, save the movement of the waters and the brush of snow against the windows. Hour after hour he waited, keeping watch on the road that led from the forest, gazing at the snow drifting down. He glanced at the clock. The hands said noon. He walked outside and stood peering up the road, but his mother was nowhere in sight. He tramped back inside and put more wood on the fire. Where could she be? He heated the porridge he'd cooked the night before, but found he wasn't hungry. He decided to whittle a piece of driftwood, but couldn't stop his eyes from wandering to the window, and he put his knife away. All afternoon he waited, keeping his eyes away from the clock, staring out the window in expectation. Snow continued falling without end, and slowly the light departed from the sky. Aaron tried to keep his thoughts at bay by busying himself with making a pot of potato soup, his mother's favorite kind. He lit all the lamps, built up the fire blazing hot, and set the table for two, with the wooden spoons she'd carved herself, and her treasured blue enamel bowls, as if to lure her in out of the darkness. He decided not to eat until she arrived. He waited an hour, 2 hours. Surely she'd just gotten a late start this morning, or been merely slowed down by the snow. Why, she was about to show up, and any minute at that. Another hour passed. At last Aaron couldn't wait any longer, and he ate his dinner alone. He was ready to fall asleep in his chair, but he refused to turn in, forcing himself to stay awake. He cocked his ear to the sound of the snow scratching against the windows like a cat, desperate to make of it horses' hoofs and the sound of wheels turning. Finally, he could keep his eyes open no longer. He rose from his chair, made certain the door was shut tight, but left it unlatched. He placed a lamp before the window that faced the road, turned it down low, and looked out one more time. Then he climbed into bed and fell asleep, waiting for the sound of a wagon. At dawn, he awoke with a start, sprang out of bed, and stopped in his tracks. His mother's bed was still empty. What could have happened? He'd been certain she'd be there in the morning. Sure, she'd have arrived during the night, creeping inside quiet as a mouse, careful not to wake him. Aaron ran to the window and looked out. He peered through the snow still falling from the sky, but nowhere was his mother to be seen. He glanced around the room and noticed her thick winter coat on the rack by the door. She hadn't thought to take it along. Suddenly, everything she'd warned him of leaped into Aaron's mind, and he was struck with the fear that she wasn't just late, but that something had happened to her. Could she have lost her way in the woods, with the roads covered with snow? Had the wagon become mired in a drift? Had she been attacked by a wolf pack, or a bear, or been fallen upon by thieves? Was she lost in the snow somewhere this very moment, shivering in the cold, calling for help? He remembered what she'd said about leaving sight of the house, but surely she hadn't meant for him to stay home at a time like this. Perhaps she was stranded just a mile from home, and if she were still close to Craftsbury, why, he'd ridden those roads every month of his life. He'd find his way through the forest, sure as an owl. After all, his birthday had passed. He was a full 12 years old, and she'd expect him to act it. He rushed about the house, found a large burlap sack, and filled it with food, enough for himself and his mother for several days. He packed his flint, a pot and a spoon, paper, pen, and ink. He put on his scarf and his mittens, and brought his mother's along, drew on his plaid wool coat, and put her own coat on over it, so she'd have it to wear. He stood in the center of the room, glancing nervously about, looking for anything he might have forgotten. Then he walked to the door and set out to find her.